Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Do you hear me loud and clear? Okay. So, in my attendance, you're about 25. Where are the others? You are 26 out of 47. How about the others? Where are they? Okay. So, here in our online class, we will gonna discuss the new lesson, and then tomorrow on-site class, we will going to have our grade consultation. Okay, so I already have my grade to you in PCOM. Am I clear to everybody? Okay, so I hope that everybody tomorrow are not absent, because that is one-on-one consultation of your grades to the subject PCOM. Okay, as well as also do not forget your notebook, so that we will going to record all the things starting on midterm. Am I clear to everybody? Jonah, are you here? I'm sorry, Wednesday pala. Sorry. Wednesday, sorry. Wednesday, yes. Thank you so much, Mitra. Brigino, are you here? Okay. So please do not remind your classmates that do not be absent and don't be late on Wednesday. Make it sure of that. Thank you. So today is another new lesson for purposive communication. Okay? And then later, after uh the video lesson that I showing you, we were gonna have our groupings here in online. Okay, and then please be sure that you have your purposive communication notebook with you right now, because you need that later. Okay, in our discussion. Before that, let's have the opening prayer.
Dear Heavenly Father, as we gather here today, we come before you with grateful hearts. Lord, we lift up our class, our teachers, and everyone who has been a part of our educational journey. May this classroom be a haven of learning, growth, and support. Help us to appreciate the gift of education and the opportunities it brings. Grant us the wisdom to face any challenges that may come our way and the compassion to support one another in our journeys. May the knowledge we gain be not only for our personal growth, but also for the betterment of our communities and the world around us. Thank you for your unwavering love and grace. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So, amen. So, today is our new lesson, which is titled Coping. So, coping intercultural communication. Okay. So, listen to the video that I will present to you. Later, we will gonna have the groupings of this video. Okay. Listen very carefully for this presentation. Afterwards, group collaboration and presentation.
For another rendition of MLL 230. This week we're going to look at intercultural communication, and our case study today will be on Japan. So, intercultural communication is exactly what it sounds like. It is the study of when you're looking at people from different cultural backgrounds. You're also looking at how they communicate, what are similar different ways, and how they endeavor to communicate across cultures. In the field of intercultural communication has developed over the years, where in the past people have looked at different cultures and said, okay, this is how someone from this culture acts versus someone from another culture, and this is why they experience culture shock. And it came from a lens of business. So a lot of business people would go to Japan, for instance, and they would try to learn the ins and outs of this culture in order to do business with them. So over the years, that's changed and become less business oriented. It became less like, here's how do you get what you want, and more egalitarian. So how do two people from different cultures communicate? And it could be two or more cultures. There's also a class at UMBC, intercultural communication, and I've taken it before. It's very good, and it also looks at what are the different cultures that underlying communication, how do they affect the way that people talk to each other. For some of you who are from different cultures, you may already kind of see the semblances of, maybe how you experience culture shock when you first moved or, to America or talked to somebody of a different culture. So, cultural conventions, they affect discourse, they affect the way that you talk, but what people have determined over the years is that it does not determine how you speak. So, for example, Japanese may exhibit more verbal feedback than their American peers. Um, so in the discourse, in the conventions, it's usually assumed that the Japanese would be more quiet, would be more silent, right? But in some scenarios, you may feel that, or you may observe that a Japanese person might have more verbal feedback. So you might be taking it back and saying, well, that's not very Japanese, right? But again, these are just guidelines. They do not determine how someone, even if they're from a particular culture, how they actually contribute to discourse community or community of practice. This field also takes into account that culture is fluid. It's not fixed, right? So, there's been plenty of studies before that have focused on the way that Chinese individuals from China speak, and they say, oh, well, Chinese are aggressive. They interrupt more. But then other studies will say, well, they're taciturn. They're very silent. Okay. So which one is it? Are they aggressive or are they silent? And the answer is both. It really depends on the context. It depends on the situation. And then people think of cultures as, someone from America or someone from Japan, but actually the reality is you may belong to multiple cultures. You may belong to, a culture such as if you're a police officer, maybe the way that you talk might be very different from if you're a civilian. If you're African American, you may speak differently than if you're of a European descent. If you're Californian, you may speak differently from a New Yorker. So culture doesn't just end at, it doesn't start and doesn't end at a national boundary. In the way you talk based on how the many different groups that you belong to also influence your culture. So culture has a lot of characteristics that are learned and they're transmitted through generations. They're symbolic and also they change over time. It's also ethnocentric, right? It has both visible and invisible attributes. So, what do I mean by ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism is the view that one's own group is the center of everything, and then all other groups are rated in reference to how they stack up in relation to one's group. From the context of the United States, that could be someone who is of European descent and they view everyone who is American from this perspective, and everyone who is from an immigrant background is not quote unquote American. So that's what we would call an ethnocentric view. So you need to be culturally aware in order to be able to interpret someone's behavior relative to its cultural context. In other words, you should be aware of the ethnocentrism that you have. For example, if you are from you're American and you go into another place, are you thinking of that place from your own lens, right? Of being an American, of being America as centralized, as everything as inferior? Or you're going to this land with the view that this place is a different place and you want to examine the similarities and differences from kind of an objective point of view, not subjective. So the field of intercultural communication has this doctrine that participants of any interaction are allowed to bring in their own linguistic and cultural background to the table. Okay, so this, like all languages, like linguists, we believe that languages are equal. Intercommunication scholars also believe that however you communicate is equal and is important to you, and also you're able to bring something to the table. There is not a culture too big that can't allow for smaller cultures to also communicate, and there's not a culture too small that can't shape a discussion or a discourse in some meaningful way. So, as far as communicative competence, this is where the difference between grammatical competence and communicative competence. So, grammatical competence is like, can you understand, um, is this person making a lot of grammatical mistakes, right? Like, is he saying like he goes instead of he went? That's different than communicative competence, whereas someone says he goes, yesterday, you understand what they're saying. They're displaying communicative competence. They're able to communicate effectively. So, forms of language not only reflect people's social position and the circumstance, but also express their view of the way society is organized and of their position within a social network. The forms of language encode a socially constructed representation of the world. Of course, we don't live in an equal society. We don't live in a globally equal society. And so the ways in which that we're able to use a language encode some sort of social representation, like it carries with it its culture. And that's why it's so important that culture and language are so closely intertwined. And I know that some of you wrote about this in the discussion boards. So there's been some research, some current research in the past few years that talks about what is the role of an English speaker, right? And why someone with quote unquote bad English, why that might actually be a positive benefit. So I've taught ESL for probably 11 years, and I have a lot of students coming up to me and saying, how can I get rid of my accent? I think we talked about this in previous classes. How can I get rid of my accent? I speak bad English. People think I speak with an accent, or, I'm coming from Nigeria where my form of English is different, or I'm coming from India where my English is different. Um, and I would say that actually you guys are the change makers, right? Because when people who are speaking English as a non-native language, um, they are actually simplifying the vocabulary. They are actually making sure everyone is heard. They're making sure the language is communicable, right? Like you can communicate. You're making this language more universally understandable. So actually, it's a good idea, right? Because this communication global consultant, Heather Hansen, she was talking about how, she had taught accent reduction classes in the past, but she actually realized that when people are speaking English as a second language, they are using the language to create meaning. And, it's not saying that non-native English speakers are bad or that they, don't also communicate to the discourse. But think about it, when you are with another English speaker, you talk very differently, right? Like you'll say idioms, like you'll say like, "Oh, that's out of the horse's mouth," or "We gotta hit this ball in the park," or "Let's put a pin on it," or like, you have all these idioms, and a lot of them are like football related. And when you're speaking to someone who is not from that context, it can be very confusing, right? So if you get rid of all that, if you're coming from, we're starting from the same context, we're starting from the same we're speaking this language that none of us finds as native, you can actually build more communication. Your communication becomes stronger. Connections with pigeons. We talked about pigeons last time, right? And we talked about how pigeons are so useful, but everyone treats them as a second class language. They say this is not really language, it's not really full fledged language. Uh, but you can learn a pigeon in 6 months, right? It does not take long to learn a pigeon. And being able to learn a language, you know, um, a classic language, may be a little bit harder. So having this kind of pigeon, having to be able to like take some aspects of one language and another language, being able to speak English in a way that reflects your own understanding actually contributes to the communicative competence. So, interaction is negotiated through communicative competence, not by misunderstanding. Okay. So, when someone doesn't speak quote unquote perfect English or quote unquote someone speaks bad English, they say, oh, they're just misunderstanding. That's not necessarily true, right? The speaker may come with their own pragmatic strategies to maintain their own varieties and values and still communicate without hindrance. Okay, not everything is a misunderstanding. Not everything is because they don't understand. And we'll see this later with the Japanese and how they view silence. Because a lot of people think that when someone's silent, they don't understand. but they do understand. They're just thinking about it, and they just need some time to think and then time to speak. So these words, conversational overlap, silence, gaze, indirect aggressivity. You'll need to know those words right now, but these are words that are captured in the reading, and these are words that talk about, what are the different instances of communicative competence. How are you able to measure, communication this way? So, what Gumpers and Cook Gumpers, what they found out, and also Kanag Jaraja, they discovered that English language learners did not actually have to have full competence of a language in order to be adept at communicating. AKA, you don't need to be an expert really in any language in order to communicate, right? And you probably noticed this if you've been to another country. You only speak a little bit of Spanish, or you only speak a little bit of French, or German. You can still communicate, or Chinese. You can still communicate, right? You don't need to understand the entirety of the language and be completely fluent in order to communicate. So this is more TED Talk by Heather Hansen. She talks about how, who does language belong to, especially English, right? Because there's people all over the world that speak English as a second and third language. We would call that the global Englishes, or Kana Garaja would call that the global Englishes. And, it's something that um, we're thinking about this decolonization mindset, that we want to, give other people an opportunity to, make a claim, or, maybe English is something that belongs to everybody and belongs to nobody. So there's this TED Talk. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about, what is the role of quote unquote bad English. So let's talk about different cultures. So there's many aspects of intercultural communication, and we're just going to focus on a few aspects. But one of them is the individualistic versus collectivist cultures. So an individualist culture, this is a culture that really fosters independence and individual achievement. Um, I would say that America is very much in this culture, right? That they say, um, you're the best. Always strive to be the best. If you think about the Olympics, right? The people who are standing at the podium and winning the gold medals, they focus on these stories of individuals and how they grew up and how they persevered and suffered. And so they're really looking at their achievements, and they're saying, okay, well, they worked hard, right? They worked hard, and that's how they were to get where they are. Um, I saw recently, like, Michael Jordan, he has a documentary out, but then also, there have been advertisements of him in the past where he has said, okay, I failed like 10,000 times. I got cut from my high school basketball team, but you know what? I persevered, right? And so this was his individual thinking. It was his personal choice. It was his self-expression. He didn't talk about, I mean, he probably talked about his coach and everything like that, but really we're an individualistic culture. We're not saying Michael Jordan is who he is because of his coach. We're saying Michael Jordan is who he is because of him. So it's associated with egalitarian relationships and flexibility in roles, including upward mobility. So this culture really says, okay, if you work hard, you can move up beyond where your ancestors, or like your parents' income level. Like you can make more money because you worked hard. You can move up the social ladder. Maybe you grew up poor, but you can end up rich, right? So this individualistic culture really focuses on this upward mobility, kind of work hard and, pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of deal, which I don't believe in, but it's associated with private property as well, or individual ownership. Like, this is mine, okay? This is my house. This is my lawn. This is my desk, right? Everything is very my. Um, so this contrasts with a collectivist culture, and we'll talk about Japan, but Japan is more of a collectivist culture. So, collectivist cultures fosters interdependence and group success. Okay, so this means that if you are a person, you're again in the Olympics, you won gold for your country. You didn't just win gold. Everyone on your team won gold, and an entire country won gold, right? So it's really talking about how did you come to your success? Everyone is really interdependent on each other. We're all relying on each other. Um, it promotes adherence to norms, respects for elders, and a group consensus. So, for example, I come from a Chinese background, and in my background, the person who eats first is the person who's the oldest. So, like, grandma would eat first. If a if I were to eat first, it would be, it would just be like a coup. Like, people would be outraged, right? Because you have to, like, show devotion to your ancestors. They lived a long time, right? And so there's lots of ancestor worship, in my culture. I'm not saying that it's true in every collectivist culture, but there's just more of a respect for your elders, right? There's a different communication style of talking to elders. Um, and so, the it's this culture really relies on stable hierarchical roles. There's a system and you fall somewhere in that system and you have a role to play in that system. It's not necessarily like that you are the bottom of the totem pole and you should stay that way and then you'll never get out. But it's more dependent on, other factors like gender, family, background, and age, and less about, you as an individual. So as you age, you'll get more respect. Um, and it's associated with shared property, group ownership. And these cultures are more likely to believe in, this group shared situation. So for example, if you were to come late to a dinner, if you're from an individualist culture and you're late to dinner, people would say, "Why were you late? Are you lazy? Did you get up late? What are you doing other things?" Right? Like, you didn't leave on time. Whereas a collectivist culture were to say, "Oh, there must have been traffic, right? There must have been some sort of obstacle, the metro's running slow." And they're able to understand and not associate that your lateness with your individual identity. So this is also another aspect of intercultural communication, talking about high context and low context cultures. So a low context culture are cultures that rely heavily on words to convey the main message. Okay, so low context culture would be German, Scandinavian, American, English, French, Italian, maybe. Okay, on the spectrum. So you have to say what you want. If you want something, you should say it, okay? And even if it's awkward, right? Like, even if you're like, I have to go, you must go now, right? Like, I'm tired, you have to leave my house. In these cultures, you have to say it because it's not implied, okay? Very few is implied. Of course, it depends on the language, and each language is on a spectrum. But for example, if you go to a German and Scandinavian country, it is very common, for someone to say, okay, you have to go, you have to leave my house. This me hosting thing, it's over, right? Or like they would say, like, it is your turn to pay now. Okay. Um American Sign Language is kind of like this, right? So I talked about in my previous classes how if you sign American Sign, you have to you tell the truth. So for example, um I was one of my students was in an exercise where he had to talk about the girl next to him, and he said, "Oh, well, she has blonde hair, she has blue eyes," and the teacher said, "Well, you didn't mention that she was fat." And then my student was like, "What?" And you really can't mince words. Like, it's not like you're calling this person, like, you're not bullying this person. You're just being very you can't mince words. Like you have to say like overweight. You like you have to be very direct in this culture. Whereas the high context culture really relies on the context of the interaction, and they believe that some words are better left unsaid. So these would be cultures like Chinese, African, Arab cultures, Greek cultures, Mexican cultures, Spanish cultures, or some elements, right? So these cultures believe that you don't need to say every single thing. They kind of find it annoying, I guess, or at least, I'm from a Chinese high context culture, and I kind of find it annoying when someone spells out everything. But you might not. You might appreciate that, right? Like you might be like, I don't want to be an ambiguity all the time. I need to know exactly, what it is I'm talking about, right? So that might be an American thing. So here's an illustration of how those cultures might take place in discourse. So this is from an artist who's Chinese who studied abroad in Germany, and they were able to illustrate, the different communication styles. So on the left in the blue is the Germans, and Germans are very direct. They'll say what they need to say. I had a German friend from Germany. She also taught at UMBC one time, and she told me, have you ever thought about brushing the back of your hair? And I said, yeah, I thought about it, but what she was telling me was that my hair was messy. I need to get I need to get a hairbrush, okay? She was like, you messy girl, you need to get a hairbrush, right? Whereas if a Chinese person, right, someone from a, kind of a high context culture, they rely heavily on the context. Okay, so they probably wouldn't say anything, or they'd say something in a very roundabout way. Or if they're truly Chinese, they would say, "Oh, I have this, hairbrush. I think it'd be look great for you." Things like that. They would say face, right? Because they don't want to threaten the relationship between the two speakers, right? So it's a very roundabout way. And some would say even like when we talked about different cultures within a nation, some would say like the North is very much this way, like people in Baltimore are very much this way. Um, and people, maybe you think people from Maryland are like this, very roundabout, very southern, very, very high context, right? So very roundabout way of saying very indirect. So, a low context culture tends to prefer direct verbal interaction. They tend to understand meaning at one level primarily. Like what I say is kind of what I do, right? So, another example for you is when I was having dinner with a German student, and I made a joke at the end of the meal because he had finished his meal. And I said, "Oh, was that disgusting?" And he was like, "What do you mean?" And I was like, "Was the meal disgusting?" He was like, "Clearly not, because I cleaned my plate." And I was like, "I know, I'm joking, right?" But, in some cultures, like, you have to be direct. You have to, figure out what you mean. Some people are like this, right? And I'm not saying it's a bad thing necessarily that you should always be, indirect. Because sometimes it's good to be indirect, or sometimes it's good to be a low context direct culture, because you're able to understand how everyone is feeling, right? Like there's no mincing of words, there's no misunderstandings, there's no misinterpretations. Um, these cultures are generally less proficient at reading nonverbal cues. Okay, so for example, if you're from a Chinese culture and you're going to someone's house and they offer you food, and you're demonstrating some polite strategy, so you say, oh no thank you, but your stomach is growling and you're like staring at the food like it's the last food you'll ever eat. You're just like, oh no thank you, so someone from a low context culture would be like, oh well, you said no thank you, no food for you, right? Because you said it, so it must be true. I'm taking you at your words, right? So communication is highly structured messages. It provides details. It gives authorities to written information. Like I want it written down, okay? And that's something that is very, very true in a low context culture, right? So like if someone is inviting you to your house, like, oh yeah, come over, you know, but they're not really inviting you unless they write it down. Like they're texting you like, hey, come over at this time. Otherwise, it's not really like a verbal it's not really a verbal arrangement unless they say otherwise. So a high context culture tends to prefer indirect verbal interaction. They tend to understand meanings embedded at many socio-cultural levels. This is when the nonverbal cues, this is, they're able to demonstrate in different ways. They're very proficient at reading people's nonverbal cues. They can read your face, right? Like if you're like, oh, I'm very happy, and you say it like this, people are like, okay, this person's not very happy. Communicates in simple, sometimes ambiguous messages. But, in a high context culture, it's okay to live in ambiguity. It's okay to live in ambiguity. It's okay to not understand everything at one time, because the world is flexible. Other differences to consider between these cultures may be frequency of eye contact, right? Because a lot of people from different Asian cultures, they don't really like eye contact. Um, Whereas like Americans and Germans, they really, eye contact is their way of determining that you're understanding the material or that you are listening. Assertiveness, use of hands while talking, um, and I've traveled a lot. I spent 2.5 months in Italy, and the use of hands, I mean, it was just like, talk about a nonverbal skill. Like, people can understand the world with just hands alone. Physical distance between communicators, speed of speech, politeness, volume of speech, use of facial expressions, and then silence, which we'll also talk about. There's this great book about it's called Without You There Is No Us. It's less to do about intercultural communication. It's more to do with this person who goes undercover as a journalist to North Korea, and she teaches English. And she discovers that because people can't say what they want to say, she knows that all her students were like standing very close to her, and she was like, okay, this is a culture where like you don't really stand um, like personal space is not really, you know, a thing. But she was able to understand that people stood close to her because they really liked her. But they couldn't say that, right? In some cultures, you don't just say, I love you, I love you, I love you, I like you. Um, in some cultures, it's a little bit more nuanced. Politeness. So politeness refers to the way that we express ourselves, which make it easier to deal with other people because through politeness, we build trust. Face, I mentioned earlier, face is the respect that person has for themselves and also in public or private. So they may have a speech act that may impose on their self-esteem or be face threatening. Okay. So in this context, like everybody has a face and not like a physical face, but like you have a respect. You have a system of respect. And if you have a positive face, it's something your self-worth has to be recognized. If you have a negative face, your self-worth has not to be imposed on. And so um, a lot of cultures they have this premise of saving face. You have to save face, right? And different people have different have their own repertoire of face saving, and it really has to do with how do you communicate with this person without threatening them or without making them lose their self-esteem. How do you ask something? How do you greet someone? The Chinese concept of face, to give you an example, in Chinese, it is very, this is what I'm talking about with the fluidity of cultures, right? Because some people would say, well, it's an Asian culture, people are very timid. But did you know that it is acceptable to ask these questions? Do you know how to live in America and not pay taxes? How much money do you make? Is your company hiring? Are you married? Would you like to marry my son or daughter? Okay. So in in American culture, this would be very threatening, face threatening, right? Because it's like this is kind of like a it is against our concepts of politeness strategies of talking about money, of talking about marriage, of talking about these various topics. But this is very these might be very common topics, in Chinese culture. To give you another example, when I taught abroad in China, I I guess like I wasn't doing a very good job. So the teacher who was observing me, she said, "Oh, you know what? Just take the rest of the day off. You look tired, like take the rest of the day off, get some rest." And I was like, "Oh, great. Like I can go home. That's great." But then I realized that she was trying to save face. Like she didn't want to tell me directly. She wanted to say that I wasn't a good she could say wasn't a good teacher, or that she wanted control of her classroom back. She just said, "Oh yeah, you look tired, like, feel free to take it easy, go home." So, in these high context cultures, you have to be really versed in the context or the culture uh in order to communicate, because so much relies on not words. So, some politeness strategies, some positive politeness strategies, there's positive and negative. The positive is usually it tries to minimize distance, okay? So, this shows that your hearer has a desire to be respected, a positive face. And this is usually seen in a group of friends. It tries to minimize the distance between them by expressing friendliness. So, if I said, for example, "You must be hungry. It's been a long time since breakfast. How about some lunch?" Right? "Oh, it seems like you're tired." Like this is positive politeness that my teacher was telling me. If you're avoiding disagreement, right, you could say, "What is she? Small?" "Yes, yes, she's small, smallish. Not really small, but certainly not very big," right? So what you're trying to say is, "I disagree," but you're just saying, "Yes, yes, yeah, she's small. I mean, not really, but not very big," because you don't want to disagree with this person. A hedge, right? Like, "Oh, you should really try harder," right? So sort of or really should, right? Instead of saying like try harder, you're saying, if you want to, maybe you could try harder. So this is hedging. You're kind of you're showing the hearer that you have that person has a desire to be respected. Okay, you recognize you respecting that person. You don't want to create too many disagreements. Whereas a negative politeness might be to assume that you might be imposing. So this assumes automatically that there might be some social distance, okay? You don't really feel that close to this person, right? So you could say you could be indirect, okay? So the positive politeness might be more direct, and negative politeness might be more indirect. So you might say, "I'm looking for a pen." Okay. This might be if you let someone borrow your pen and you said, "Oh, yeah, I'm just looking for a pen." Request forgiveness. "Oh, please forgive me, but like can you do me a favor?" Things like that. Minimize imposition. "Oh, I just wanted to ask you, I was just wondering if I could use your computer." So this is where you're imposing, right? Like you're not necessarily respecting the person as in positive politeness, but you feel like, you know, there's some social distance in this hierarchy that you're imposing in some way. Power differentials also play a role in this context. So, whether or not you are dominating the conversation, are you interrupting? Are you talking at length? Okay. Are you switching from topic to topic? This also, kind of shows if someone has, dominance over the conversation. It also shows control of the participants' contributions by telling them what to speak or what to speak about. So, if you're introducing someone at a conference, you'd say like, "Oh, this person is going to talk about X," right? Maybe you're evaluating the other person's contributions, you're approving or praising someone. That means that you are of the, you have this sort of power dynamic to where you can talk about this other person, right? Um, Mode of address, you're telling someone doctor, you're saying madam or sir. Use questions, statements, acknowledging the other person's contribution or not, right? That shows a power differential. So there's different ways, and I'm sure you've witnessed a lot of these, but there's different ways in which people can maintain power even in speech. It shows that someone is, in charge of the situation, that someone's, has more power than them. So, Wolof and Wolof greetings. So the Wolof, they're a pastoral group who live along Senegal, and they have a different set of classes or castes. So they have griots, which are the praise singers. They have former slaves. They have freemen. They have nobles. And depending on, who you are in a situation, the greetings are highly formal. So there can be a salutation, praise of God, health question. So a lot of people are studying Korean right now. You might find this in Korean where there's, depending on different, the social hierarchy, you might be addressing someone differently. So if there's a greeter, they'll say, for example, Salam alaikum, which is in Arabic, says peace be with you. And then they'll say, salam alaikum, or alaikum salam, right? So there's kind of this greeter, greetee, like greeter, responder, right? So, I'm not going to read the rest of this, but there's a lot of different, the ways in which you greet someone might be rooted in this social hierarchy. So, there's also different, a lot of different other factors as well. So, what is the function? What is the social rank? Who initiated? What is the movement? What is the stress? Because sometimes, like, you want to switch your tempo or your pitch based on who you're greeting. So let's talk a little bit about cross-cultural conflicts. Cross-cultural conflicts is when people of different cultures, maybe there's a high context, maybe there's a low context, and then there's some culture clash. So experts recommend that the first step is simply to speak to the other person in order to clarify what the problem is. The goal is to arrive at a common definition of the problem. This means trying to understand the other person's position. Above all, both bilinguals have to make it clear that they are interested in finding a solution. So is speaking really the most, is it the solution to everything? Probably not. But, I'll just show you some examples where there might be some of these clashes. So our case study today, we'll look at Japan. And of course, Japan is a high context culture. So this cartoon says, hey, have you fixed the toilet leakage? And this person says, I cannot deny the possibility that the highly toxic sewage is still leaking. And this person said, so what? Is it still leaking or not? And he says, look, I'm trying to fit into Japan's high context culture by leaving things better left unsaid. So it's kind of like a haha funny because obviously they didn't fix the toilet. But, sometimes the Americans, when they go to Japan, they're confused. This is how they, sometimes like this is how they're able to communicate. And you don't know if it's a yes or no. So it's a little bit awkward for them or can lead to these conflicts, as I mentioned earlier. So this is an example from a bank, HSBC, I think. And it's not Japan, it's from Hong Kong. But, in Hong Kong culture, in Chinese culture, you're supposed to leave a little bit of your food left over to show that you are satisfied, right? Because if you finish your meal, that's your host's way of saying, oh, you finished your meal, I didn't feed you enough, right? So they go and get you more food. So this person coming from America, probably, here it's like you have to finish everything on your plate. So he finishes everything on his bowl or plate, and then the Chinese businessmen are like, all right, we need to get him some more. And then he feels like he, out of politeness, has to eat everything. And so he's full, he's stuffed. He can't possibly have more soup or whatever he's giving to him. They're giving to him. So, um, Hofstede, he was this Dutch social psychologist, and he was really the first to map out cultural values on a scale. So they were able to look at, power, distance, individualism, feminine, masculine, uncertainty, avoidance, long term orientation, or restraint, indulgence. And, given a number, they're able to kind of map out, depending on the cultures, what are the different orientations that people have. So, power distance, are they more egalitarian or are they a culture that embraces hierarchy? Individualism, are they more collectivist or are they more individualist? Feminine, masculine, I actually don't like these terms. I think these terms are outdated. We're in the 21st century. Come on, why are we still using feminine, masculine? Um, but in Hofstede's definition, feminine is like nurture is more important. Like, I want a job that has more quality of life, which is also is like not feminine or masculine, but I digress. And then in his rating, he says like a masculine culture, the power is more important, which is kind of toxic masculinity, but uncertainty avoidance, comfortable with ambiguity, or does ambiguity create anxiety? Okay. Long-term orientation, do they put their short-term goals first? Are they like saving every single cent, waiting for a rainy day, or are they more YOLO? You only live once, putting their I'm sorry. YOLO is putting their short-term goals first, and then long-term goals would be putting aside money every single day, waiting for a rainy day. Restraint, indulgence, happiness can be bad, or happiness is always good, like you're always chasing some sort of happiness. Or is too much happiness, it's okay to be sad because you can't be too much, it's not healthy for you to be too happy. So if you map out Japan and the United States, I gave you the link where you can map out your own individual culture as well. But you notice that in Japan, the power distance is higher. People respect people of power. People respect elderly. People respect titles. Individualism, United States, we really not get out of the water with our individualism. Everything is a consequence of what you do, your upbringing, where you come from, your because of you. Um, they would say Japan is a more masculine society in which they value power, right, over kind of this nurturing, this quality of life. I kind of disagree with the United States. I kind of believe that should be higher. Uncertainty avoidance. Japan has a more attention to ambiguity. It's okay for things to be ambiguous versus in the United States, it's we the ambiguity creates anxiety, right? Like a lot of people are like, okay, I need to know everything on the syllabus. When are things due? If there's nothing on the syllabus, if something is TBD, I need to know right now. What I'm gonna do. Whereas the Japanese are more comfortable with having this. Okay, I'm sure it will be revealed to me later. I will just hold on, right? Long-term orientation, Japan is more likely to look at things in a broader perspective, whereas the United States kind of think of things as short-term. And you can see that we rank really low on this. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about why do Americans always think of things as short-term? And that indulgence, like I said, like Americans are more likely to indulge in themselves and to think about, okay, I need this iPhone now, versus Japanese might be, might think happiness is you don't need to be constantly satisfied all the time. So politeness in Japan, differences in social status and power are clearer and more important in Japan. So the Japanese language also supports this system. There's different ways that you communicate to people, based on this hierarchy, based on this power, the social status. They have Keigo, which is a special polite language used to show respect when speaking to superiors or people outside of one's own language group. And it's more polite to keep others outside of the group. Okay. Whereas here we would find that to be exclusive, right? We want people, because we live in a more egalitarian cultural society. So we don't really if you're able to speak a different language to somebody, well, that's good in Japan. In America, that's kind of seen as exclusionary. The Japanese also acknowledge superiority more clearly and use negative politeness to people outside the groups. So they apologize to maintain a good relationship, even if they are wrong, even if they disagree or they criticize. They do so very indirectly. They're very indirect. They want to save face. However, politeness in American English, social status and power are not so clear, are less important than in Japan. Americans may use more positive politeness than the Japanese. They might use more direct forms than the Japanese. So for Americans, it is polite to include other people in one's language group by using informal language, like y'all, for example. So the differentness in polite and friendly are they're able to switch from, like if for example, if someone were to say, Dr. Chung, and you'd switch from my first name, which is May, it's not, a great offense to use the first name to address a person whose politeness or respectful attitude is expected. But if you did this in Japan, it would be very different, right? So the Japanese, they have to like learn the American structure of polite and friendly, which is very different from their own native definitions. Also, accepting a compliment. So Americans are more likely to accept a compliment and say like, "Oh yeah, thank you. You look nice today. Oh, thank you. I got a lot of sleep, or it's springtime or whatever." Or the Japanese say, "Oh, you have a really nice day." They're more likely to say, they're more likely to reject the compliment. They said, "Oh no, I don't. You're too kind. I don't think so. You look nice today." So American speakers were more likely to engage in deflection responses. So, like, "Oh, you did a really great job in the presentation." They said, "Oh, really? Because I messed up on this. Did I really do well?" Right? So that's deflecting. But Japanese speakers are more likely to respond with self-denigration. Um, you did really well in that presentation. They're like, "Oh no, I did not. Like didn't. I don't think that's true. I spent, you know, 2 minutes on it. Like, I didn't do well. So even the ways that they accept a compliment can be very different. So this is kind of what I said earlier in integration of other people, whether they're polite or friendly. Polite and friendly mean different concepts in Japanese, versus American. If someone's polite, they're also friendly, right? They're able to accept or return a compliment, like, "Oh, you look nice. Oh, you do too." Deflect, right? So it's more polite to include other people, where in Japanese it's polite to keep people outside of your friend group or outside of the group, the social group. So how they speak, Japanese often speak in a roundabout way compared to Westerners, who are very to the point. Japanese start with an explanation of the background and then follow it with the point of what they're getting at. And they dislike specifying things to the last detail, right? So there's lots of silence, right? So the interlocutor, the person they're communicating with, has to figure out what are the parts left unsaid, because the parts left unsaid are often the most important. So I'll just give you an example. This is located on Blackboard, just like an example of a text in which there is these power differentials. And I'll show you kind of differences of how they're able to use negative politeness and positive politeness and silence. So here are the power differentials. There's an American manager, A, right? So this is a person who, she knows that people from other cultures communicate differently. She knows that Japanese might communicate differently, but she's never visited Japan before. So this is her first time interacting with Japanese officials. Then you have S, who's a Japanese manager. They're the regional business general manager or vice president. And then you have J, who's a junior staff. Okay, so you have A, the American, S, who's Japanese, and then J, who's also Japanese, but below S, hierarchical. So this person said, the American says, Does this show up in the customer satisfaction surveys? And Jay says, I think so. American, yes. Jay, 2, I think so. American, will we see some of these results? S. But as I said, the problem had started October last year. American, yeah, so it's 1 year. Um, as the manager, the Japanese manager. A little early to see the data, right? And the American says, as you were talking, I realized I don't have a general background understanding of the business in Japan. For example, could you just give me a little bit of the background? So the Japanese are using negative politeness. They are able to show that there's a hierarchy. Okay, there's a social standing here. They're able to be indirect. So someone says, okay, does this show up in the customer satisfaction surveys? And the Japanese says, I think so. And then the American says, yes, because she's looking for a yes or no. I don't want to, I think so. She wants a very direct answer. And then the person repeats, I think so. So again, negative politeness because you're being very indirect here. Okay, you're not really saying yes or no. Being very indirect, maybe on purpose. Maybe it's part of their intercultural communication style. But you can see here that the American, they're using some of the hedging. Okay, yeah, I don't have an understanding. Like it's could you give me like very indirect. Like could you do this for me? Um, so this is more like it is more to show the respect versus the imposition. Because this American, is not understanding and they just need more context. They're saying, give me more context. So American says, do you see when you look at the customer satisfaction results, and Jay mentioned that he's also involved in the employee satisfaction. Japanese says somewhat. American says somewhat, yeah. When you look at these two things together, do you see relationships between customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction? Japanese says, yeah. American says, which comes first? The Japanese says, what is your assumption? The American says, well, I don't know. I mean, the Japanese says, since you have an assumption, that's what you're asking, right? The question. American says, well, I don't know whether I have an assumption or not. I think they're related, but I'm not quite sure how. I'm not sure whether on one hand, you could say if we have a very satisfied employees, whatever that means, motivated, productive, the customers will recognize that and that we're producing good, friendly support. And Japanese says, I think to begin with, people are motivated, they do a good job to serve customers. That's why the customers become happy. So again, a lot of negative politeness here. The Japanese, they're not saying yes or no, they're saying somewhat. And even though the Japanese says yeah, they're saying yeah after 2 beats of silence. So it's like, hey, when you look at these things together, do you see the relationships? They go, yeah. So that's not really a yes, right? If someone says like, hey, do you want to like go grab dinner sometime? They're like, yeah. Like it's not a full-fledged yes. So they're still being very indirect. They're saying, what is your assumption? Kind of like, what do you think, right? Kind of, they don't want to impose. But the American is using positive politeness. They're saying, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how, right? So kind of referring back to that individualist standpoint, um, hedging a little bit, but this person still does not understand. This person is still like trying to get information, trying to get answers. And so finally they agree on a chicken and egg situation, and they both participate in positive politeness. So chicken and egg, and the American says, yes, right. And then the Japanese says, right, I agree. So this is their way of, being direct now. Okay, they are able to come to a consensus. They agree. So let's talk a little bit about silence. In the United States, silence is viewed negatively, embarrassing, isolating, or representative of a lack of knowledge. But if you're silent in Japanese or East Asian culture, this has a emphasis on silence and harmony, right? Like you don't want to impose, you don't want to, you're thinking, right? And a secondary emphasis on speech. It's not like you don't know. So to give an example, there is some sort of silence in the speech. where this person is talking and there's four seconds of silence, right? And then the Japanese says 3 seconds of silence. It's very difficult to answer, but if you force me to pick one employee, I think. So the American is thinking that this person doesn't understand. Their silence is interpreted as a lack of understanding. But really, they just need more time. They do understand, but they just need more time. So, I'm sure you witness this in your classes where if you're silent, the teacher doesn't things that you don't know. But in other cultures, this is Oriental here, but I'm going to change it because that's outdated. But silence can indicate respect, agreement, disagreement. I didn't say anything because I agree. I didn't say anything because I disagree. I didn't say anything because I respect. Okay, or they're trying to show modesty. So silence is a social tool. It does something, but the intercultural differences, people can say, can mislead people or, maybe even lead to violence. So here's an example of someone using of the UC Davis silent protest. So, why did the protesters decide to use silence? Sometimes silence can be powerful. Sometimes it can be very powerful. Silence can serve as power, authority, but also humility, obligation, deference. The facial expressions, the body stance, the gestures. In silence, these are used, these didactic markers are used prominently. They mean a lot more when there's silence. Right, so your discussion questions for today. Why might speaking bad English be considered desirable or advantageous? Number two, describe some instances of interactions you've ever had with a low context or high context culture. Were there instances of confusion or culture shock? And number three, in what ways can silence be used as a form of power? Is it effective? We have a lot of cultures represented in this class, so I'm interested to hear what you think. See you on the discussion board.
So that is what intercultural discussion taught us about the different communication around the globe, different languages that we mix in and we mix needs to follow about it. Okay. So today I'm going to have a random groupings of 8 for each groups. There will be a question that you need to answer, so you will be grouped in 8 starting now.
Wala daw yung sagot sa
Wait lang po. Dali. Yung iba walang Sige po, 5 na lang. Dahil, ah, ano ba to? Ang gulo naman ninyo. Kanina 27. Ngayon naman 35 na. Sige, 5 groups na lang. Ayan, much better. Dali lang. Mukhang hindi ako naririnig eh. Sige, game. Kung ano po yung assigned group number, yun po lang ang sasagutan ninyo. For group number 1, you will be answering number 1 question. For group number 2, number 2 only. For group number 3, number 3. Number 4, 4. Number 5, 5. Yun lang. Nagets po ba? Hello? Hindi yung marami kayo sinasabi niyan. Bakibao ko kayo. Now, this group is individual work. This group is individual work. Kahit naka-group po kayo, individual work pa rin po tayo. Quiz number 2. Pakilagay sa notebook, quiz number 2, tapos kung anong group number po kayo. Do not forget, copy and answer your designated question. Okay? Quiz number 3. Quiz number 3. Tapos, yung group number mo, copy mo yung tanong, sabay sagot. Okay? On our face-to-face, recitation tayo. Today, recitation tayo by group. Okay, so we will gonna have our graded recitation on Wednesday in our class. Thank you very much and good afternoon.